The Eth were a peaceful people. They had lived on their beautiful world for 12,000 years. They made crystal art that other species traveled across the galaxy to see. They wrote poetry that made even the coldest hearts feel something. They had no army. They had no weapons. They believed that kindness was the highest form of intelligence. Their world, Eth Prime, was a paradise. Crystal forests stretched across vast continents. Sapphire oceans reflected twin moons. Children played in meadows filled with flowers that sang when the wind touched them. 4 billion souls called this world home. But the universe does not care about kindness. The scientists discovered it first. A rogue neutron star, dead and dark and impossibly heavy, was drifting through space. Its path would bring it close to the system, not close enough to hit them, but close enough that its terrible gravity would tear their world apart like paper in a storm. They had 18 months. 18 months until their oceans boiled. 18 months until their crystal forests shattered. 18 months until every child, every poet, every dreamer on Eth Prime was dead. High Matriarch received the news in her chambers. She was old even by Eth standards. Her crystalline wings had faded from bright blue to soft gray. She had led her people through famines, through plagues, through every challenge nature had thrown at them. But this was different. This was not a challenge. This was an ending. She did not cry. She was too hollowed out for tears. The Galactic Concord was supposed to help. That was the whole point of the Concord. 847 species, united together, helping each other through the darkness of space. The Eth had been members for 3,000 years. They had shared their art freely. They had given their poetry to any species that asked. They had believed in the Concord's promise of unity. Stood before the Great Assembly. Thousands of alien faces looked down at her from their seats. Some had scales. Some had fur. Some had no faces at all, just glowing shapes that flickered with thought. She had addressed this body many times before, always with hope in her heart. Today there was only desperation. "We need ships," she said. Her voice was steady, even though her hearts were breaking. "We have calculated the numbers. With enough transport vessels, we can evacuate our entire population. We can save everyone. We are asking the Conquered for help." The assembly was silent. Then the whispers began. The ambassador spoke first. They were the most powerful species in the Conquered. They had the biggest fleet, the strongest weapons, the loudest voice. Their ambassador was a tall creature covered in silver scales, with eyes like black stones. "The logistics are challenging," he said. His voice was smooth like oil on water. "Moving 4 billion individuals would require thousands of ships. The fuel costs alone would strain our entire economy, and we must consider the precedent. If we evacuate the Eth, what happens when the next species faces disaster? And the next? The Conquered cannot save everyone." Other ambassadors nodded. They spoke of budgets and logistics and political complications. They talked about the Eth like they were numbers on a screen, not living beings with families and dreams and futures that were about to be erased. Listened. With each word she felt her hope crumble a little more. "The Eth have contributed much to our culture," another ambassador said. He was a small creature with kind eyes, but his voice was apologetic. "But we must be realistic. They have no strategic resources, no military value. We must make decisions based on what benefits the Conquered as a whole." No strategic value. The words hit like a physical blow. Her people had spent 12,000 years creating beauty, and in the end it meant nothing. Their poetry did not fuel starships. Their crystal art did not power shields. Their kindness had no market price. The vote was called. Stood alone in the center of the chamber as species after species made their choice. She watched the numbers appear on the great display screen. The result was announced: abstention by consensus. They were not saying no. That would require courage. They were simply choosing not to decide. They were stepping back with clean hands and clear consciences and letting 4 billion people die. "We extend our deepest sympathies," the ambassador said, "during this difficult transition." Transition, as if extinction was just a change in management. The transmission ended. The great screen went dark. Stood in the silence of her chambers, surrounded by advisors who were weeping the chittering grief song of their people. The sound filled the room like rain on glass. She did not join them. There were no tears left in her. There was only emptiness. Outside her window, children were playing in the crystal gardens. They did not know yet. They did not know that the galaxy had looked at them and decided they were not worth saving. They were laughing, chasing each other through the singing flowers, their small wings catching the light of the sun that would soon kill them. I watched them for a long time. Then her advisor approached with a small note, a minor update, almost not worth mentioning. Matriarch, there was one objection to the vote. A young species called humanity. They filed a formal protest. I had heard of humans. They had joined the conquered less than a century ago. They were small, soft, short-lived creatures from a tiny blue world. They had no great fleet, no ancient wisdom, no power that mattered. "What did they say?" she asked, though she knew it would change nothing. Her advisor checked the record. They said the vote was wrong. They said they would not accept it. I almost smiled. Almost. The innocence of young species. They still believed that refusing to accept something could change it. They had not yet learned that the universe did not care what you accepted or rejected. It simply happened. "Note it for the records," she said, "and begin the preparations." "What preparations, matriarch?" She looked out at the children playing in the garden. They had 18 months left, 18 months to live, to laugh, to love. She would not let them spend those months in fear. "We will write our final poems," she said. "We will compose our death songs. We will face our ending with dignity. That is all we have left." Her advisor bowed and left. I stood alone at the window, watching her world enjoy its last days in ignorance. She did not know that across the galaxy, on a small blue planet called Earth, someone was refusing to accept the unacceptable. She did not know that humanity had just begun to move. 3 hours after the conquered vote, Admiral Helena sat in a room full of important people who were explaining why nothing could be done. The room was in Geneva, on Earth, deep inside the headquarters of the Terran Coalition. Around the table sat generals with medals on their chests, politicians with worried faces, and economists with charts that showed very large numbers. "Admiral, we understand your frustration," said a politician with gray hair and tired eyes. "But the math simply does not work. We have 340 ships. Moving 4 billion ETH would require thousands. The fuel costs would bankrupt 3 of our colonies. The conquered might impose sanctions. This mission is not just difficult, it is impossible." Everyone nodded. The math was clear. The numbers did not lie. Helena was 57 years old. She had served in the fleet for 35 years. She had fought pirates and saved colonies and negotiated peace treaties. She had seen the best and worst of humanity across 100 worlds. She was also tired of listening to people explain why kindness was impossible. "Show me the ETH," she said. Her aide pulled up images on the screen. Cities made of crystal, forests that sparkled like diamonds, and children, small, delicate creatures with wings like glass, playing in gardens filled with singing flowers. "These are the people we are talking about," said. "Not numbers, not logistics. Children. 4 billion children who will die screaming as their world tears itself apart, and we are sitting here talking about fuel costs." "Admiral," the gray-haired politician said gently, "we sympathize. We truly do. But sympathy does not build ships. We simply do not have the resources." Looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked around the table at all the important people with their important concerns. "Then we will find them," she said. She stood up and walked out of the room. Behind her, she heard confused voices asking what she was doing, where she was going, Who was going to authorize this? She did not answer. She had work to do. What happened next would later be called the Great Volunteering. It began with a single broadcast. Admiral appeared on every screen on every human world. She stood in her uniform, looking directly into the camera, and she spoke simply. "My name is Helena. Most of you do not know me, but I need to tell you about something important. Right now, across the galaxy, there is a species called the Eth. They are peaceful people. They make beautiful art. They write poetry that makes you cry. And in 18 months, every single one of them will be dead." She paused. Across 100 worlds, billions of humans were listening. The Galactic Concord decided not to help them. They said it was too expensive, too complicated, too difficult. They decided that 4 billion lives were not worth the trouble. Her voice hardened. "I disagree." She explained what she needed: ships, any ships, cargo freighters, passenger liners, mining vessels, anything that could carry people through space. She explained the risks. The Conquered might punish them. The mission might fail. People might die. "I am not ordering anyone to join me," she said. "I am asking. If you have a ship, if you can fly, if you believe that we did not crawl out of the mud of our to become the kind of species that watches children die because it is expensive to save them, then join me." She gave the coordinates of a rendezvous point. "We leave in 1 week. And to the Eth people, if you can hear this, I want you to know something. You are not alone. Help is coming. Hold on." The broadcast ended. For 6 hours, nothing happened. The politicians breathed sighs of relief. The economists updated their charts. Everyone assumed the Admiral had embarrassed herself with an emotional outburst that would be forgotten by morning. Then the ships started arriving. First came the cargo freighters, big, ugly vessels designed to haul grain and metal across the stars. Their captains were weathered men and women who had spent their lives moving things from place to place. Now they would move people. Then came the mining ships, massive vehicles built to crack asteroids and extract ore. Their crews were rough and practical and not given to sentiment, but they showed up anyway. Then came the passenger liners, sleek vessels that normally carried tourists and their owners emptied their schedules and pointed their ships toward the rendezvous point. Then came the yachts. Rich people with private spacecraft decided that their vacation could wait. A famous actress donated her personal vessel. A retired businessman flew his luxury cruiser himself, refusing to let anyone else take the risk. Then came the colony ships, massive generation ships designed to carry thousands of people to new worlds. They were pulled from mothballs and storage yards, their old engines coaxed back to life by engineers who worked without sleep. And then came the Carnival of Stars. The Carnival was a retired cruise liner, 80 years old, held together by patches and prayers and the stubbornness of her captain. Maria Santos was 82 years old. She had been flying since before most of the admirals in the fleet were born. When she heard the broadcast, she called her old crew out of retirement. "One more trip," she told them. "One more trip and then we can rest." They came. Gray-haired engineers and elderly pilots and grandmothers who had once been navigation officers. They fired up the old engines and limped toward the rendezvous point, trailing sparks and leaking coolant. Private citizens across human space emptied their savings accounts to buy fuel for ships they would never own. Colonies voted to delay their own supply shipments, sending the vessels to join the fleet instead. Factories worked overtime to produce emergency supplies. No one ordered them to do it. No one forced them. They simply decided, each one alone and all of them together, that this was the kind of species they wanted to be. By the end of the week, 2,847 ships had gathered at the rendezvous point. They were not a military force. They were a collection of cargo haulers and passenger ships and mining vessels and one very old cruise liner. They looked like a junkyard that had learned to fly. Admiral stood on the bridge of her flagship, the TCS Defiance, and looked at the fleet around her. Tears were running down her face, though she would deny it if anyone asked. "All ships," she said into the comm. "This is Admiral, set course for Eth Prime." The ragtag armada began to move. As they crossed into conquered space, broadcast one final message on all frequencies, in every language the galaxy spoke. "This is Admiral Helena of the Terran Coalition. We are en route to Eth Prime. We are not asking permission. We are not seeking approval. To the Eth people, hold on. We are coming." She paused. She knew the whole galaxy was listening. "To anyone who would try to stop us, not today." The transmission ended. The fleet flew on. Behind them, the galaxy had already begun to change. The journey to Eth Prime would take 3 months. 3 months of flying through conquered space. 3 months of watching and waiting and wondering what would try to stop them. They did not have to wonder for long. The hegemony could not openly attack a member species conducting a relief mission. That would be too obvious, too direct, too easy to condemn. Instead, they chose quieter methods. First came the debris fields. Ships would emerge from faster-than-light travel and find their path blocked by natural asteroid clusters that had somehow appeared exactly where the fleet needed to go. The human navigators would plot new courses around them, losing hours, sometimes days. Then came the sensor jammers, strange signals that scrambled navigation systems and made ships drift off course. Cargo vessels would suddenly find themselves hundreds of kilometers from where they should be. The fleet had to slow down, reform, check, and recheck their positions. Then came the training exercises. Warships would appear in front of the fleet, conducting military drills that just happened to block the fastest route forward. The humans would have to wait or go around, always losing time. Admiral watched all of this with cold eyes. She understood what was happening. They were not trying to destroy them. They were trying to delay them. Every hour lost was an hour closer to the Eth extinction. If they could slow the fleet down enough, if they could make the mission take too long, the humans would arrive to find a dead world. She would not let that happen. But then the sabotage began. The Carnival of Stars was flying at the back of the fleet. The old cruise liner was slow and fragile, her engine straining with every jump. But her captain, Maria Santos, refused to let her ship fall behind. "We started this together," she told her crew. "We finish it together." No one saw the strike team board the ship. They were professionals, trained for infiltration, equipped with cloaking technology that made them invisible to human sensors. They slipped through the hull, made their way to the reactor, and planted their charges. The explosion was small but perfectly placed. The reactor cracked. Radiation began to leak. Emergency alarms screamed through the ship. Captain Santos was on the bridge when the alarm started. She was 82 years old. She had been a pilot for 60 years. She knew, in the first second after the explosion, exactly what had happened and exactly what it meant. The reactor was going to blow. When it did, everyone on the ship would die. Unless someone stopped it. "Clear the bridge," she ordered. Her voice was calm, the kind of calm that comes when you have already accepted what must be done. "Captain," her first officer looked at her with wide eyes. "The reactor needs to be vented manually. That means someone has to stay at the controls. I am the oldest person on this ship. My life is already mostly over. Get everyone to the escape pods. Now." They argued. Of course they argued. But Maria Santos had been giving orders for 60 years, and her crew knew better than to disobey. They evacuated. 3,000 people crowded into escape pods and lifeboats and anything else that would fly. And Maria Santos walked down to the reactor room alone. The heat was terrible. The radiation was already eating at her body. She could feel herself dying as she worked the controls, but her hands were steady. 60 years of flying, 60 years of practice. She knew exactly what to do. She vented the reactor into space. A jet of superheated plasma shot out of the ship, carrying the explosion away from the hull. The carnival of stars shuddered, groaned, and went dark. But it did not explode. Maria Santos sat down on the floor of the reactor room. She was too weak to stand, too weak to move, but she had enough strength left to reach her communicator. "This is Captain Santos to the fleet," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "The Carnival is dead in space, but she is stable. My crew is safe. Do not slow down for us. Do not turn back. You have children to save." Admiral's voice came through the comm, thick with emotion. "Maria." "Helena," the old woman smiled, though no one could see it. "I have had a good life, a long life. Let me give it meaning at the end. Now get moving. That is an order from your elder." The fleet flew on. The carnival of stars drifted alone in the darkness, a monument to one old woman's courage. But the sabotage had consequences they did not expect. 17 species had been watching the human fleet, minor members of the conquered, species with small voices and little power. They had seen the vote. They had watched the galaxy abandon the Eve. They had felt ashamed but had done nothing. Now they saw something different. They saw an 82-year-old woman die to save strangers. They saw humans pushing forward despite every obstacle. They saw courage, real courage, the kind that asks for nothing in return. And something changed inside them. They were the first. They were a species of healers, known across the galaxy for their hospital ships. They sent 40 vessels to join the human fleet, filled with doctors and medical supplies. Then came they were legendary navigators, able to find paths through space that no computer could calculate. They sent 100 of their best pilots to guide the human ships. Then came the Hollow Men. No one really understood the Hollow Men. They were made of living crystal, they communicated only in mathematics, and they had not spoken to the conquered in centuries. But one day, 200 of their ships simply appeared alongside the human fleet. They transmitted a single equation. It took the human scientists 3 hours to solve it. When they finally decoded the message, it read, "Some things cannot be calculated. This is one of them." The fleet grew. 3,000 ships became 3,400. Cargo vessels flew alongside crystal beings. Human pilots navigated beside masters. Doctors prepared their hospitals for the wounded to come. And then they reached the blockade. They had finally lost patience. 40 dreadnoughts hung in space at the edge of territory. 200 cruisers supported them. Behind them were weapons platforms, sensor stations, and enough firepower to destroy a small moon. Admiral commanded the blockade. He was old and experienced, a warrior who had fought in a dozen campaigns. He had been ordered to stop the human fleet, and he intended to obey. His message was simple: turn back or be destroyed. Admiral called a fleet-wide conference. Every captain, every pilot, every volunteer who had come this far. She appeared on screens across 3,000 ships, her face tired but determined. "You have all heard the ultimatum," she said. "They will destroy us if we try to pass. They have the ships. They have the weapons. They can do it." She paused. "I am giving you the choice to withdraw. No one will judge you. No one will blame you. You have already done more than anyone could ask." She waited. Not a single ship broke formation. "Well then," said, and for the first time in weeks she smiled, "let us go save some children." The fleet accelerated toward the blockade. Admiral stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the human fleet approach. He had served the hegemony for 40 years. He had fought wars that most species had forgotten. He had destroyed fleets and conquered worlds and done whatever his government commanded. But he had never seen anything like this. The human fleet was not slowing down. They were accelerating, flying straight at his blockade, straight at his guns, straight at certain death. "They are not raising weapons," his tactical officer reported, confusion in her voice. Their shields are configured for debris deflection, not combat. They are not preparing to fight. Studied the formation on his screen. The human warships were at the back, protecting the transports. The cargo vessels and passenger liners were at the front. They had placed their weakest ships in the most dangerous position. They were not an invasion force. They were a rescue mission, and they were using their own bodies as shields. "Open a channel," he ordered. "Admiral, this is. You are entering a restricted zone. You will turn back immediately or we will open fire." The human woman's face appeared on his screen. She looked tired. Dark circles under her eyes, hair starting to gray at the temples, uniform wrinkled from months of stress. But her eyes were calm. The kind of calm he recognized. The calm of someone who had already accepted what was coming. "Admiral," she said, "your ships are faster than ours, stronger than ours, better armed than ours. You can destroy us, but you cannot stop us." Felt something cold in his stomach. "Explain." "We have 3,400 ships. You can kill the first 1,000, the second 1,000, but while you are reloading, while your crews are watching us burn, the last ships will get through." She paused. "I have done the math, so have you. At least some of us will reach Eth Prime. That is not a threat, Admiral. It is a fact. You would die for a species you have never met." The human woman smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had already made peace with their choices. "Admiral, we would die for a species we have never met. Imagine what we will do for the ones we have." Cut the transmission. He stood alone on his bridge, his crew watching him, waiting for orders. His political handler was the first to speak. "Admiral, our orders are clear. The human fleet must not reach Eth Prime. You are authorized to use any means necessary." "I understand our orders," said quietly. "Then give the command, destroy them." Looked at the screen. The human fleet was still approaching. He could see the individual ships now. A cargo freighter with patches on its hull, a mining vessel trailing exhaust, a passenger liner that had probably never been in danger its entire existence. And at the center of the formation, surrounded by warships that had placed themselves between civilian vessels and his guns, he could see one image repeated on hull after hull. Children. The humans had painted pictures of Eth children on their ships. They wanted his crews to see who they were killing. Admiral, his tactical officer, was waiting. Was silent. In his mind, he was remembering something his grandfather had told him, long ago, when he was young and thought that victory was the only thing that mattered. "The measure of a species," his grandfather had said, "is not how they treat their allies. It is how they treat those who cannot help them." The Eth could not help humanity. They had no weapons, no resources, no strategic value. They could offer nothing in return for their rescue. And yet here were 3,000 ships flying towards certain death, for no reason except that children were going to die if they did not act. Had been a warrior his entire life. He had done terrible things in the name of the hegemony. He had told himself that it was necessary, that the strong must rule, that mercy was weakness. But standing here, watching a fleet of cargo ships fly toward his guns with pictures of children painted on their hulls, he felt something he had not felt in decades. Shame. "Admiral," his political handler was growing angry. "I demand that you give the order to fire. This is a direct command from the Hegemony Council." "I heard you the first time," said. His voice was very quiet. "Then obey." Looked at the human fleet one more time. They were close now, close enough that his guns could not miss, close enough that he could destroy them with a single command. He thought about his grandfather. He thought about the Eth children who would die if the humans failed. He thought about what history would say about him, about this moment, about the choice he was about to make. Then he gave an order that ended his career. "All ships stand down. Clear a lane through the formation. Let them pass." The bridge went silent. His tactical officer stared at him. His political handler sputtered with rage. "Admiral, you cannot. The conquered can court-martial me," said. He was surprised to find that he felt calm, lighter than he had felt in years. "They can strip my rank. They can put me in prison. But I will not be the admiral who murdered 10,000 civilians for the crime of compassion." He walked to the observation window and looked out at his fleet. "Clear the lane now." Slowly, reluctantly, his ships began to move. The massive dreadnoughts turned aside. The cruisers pulled back. A path opened through the blockade, wide enough for the human fleet to pass. Admiral appeared on his screen again. Her eyes were wet. "Admirals, thank you." "Do not thank me," he said. "I have simply chosen which side of history I want to be remembered on. Now go, save your children." The human fleet entered the lane. They flew in silence, 3,000 ships passing through a corridor of weapons, flying toward a world they had never seen to save people they had never met. But something strange happened as they passed. On the ships, crew members began appearing at observation windows. Soldiers, engineers, officers. They lined the corridors and the decks and the viewing platforms, watching the human fleet pass. Some of them were curious. Some of them were confused. But some of them, the ones who had been watching the longest, the ones who had seen the cargo ships and the mining vessels and the passenger liners flying towards certain death with pictures of children painted on their hulls. Some of them saluted, watched until the last human ship had passed through. Then he turned away from the window. His political handler was already sending messages to the Hegemony Council. His career was over. His reputation was destroyed. He would spend the rest of his life answering for this moment. But when he closed his eyes, he could still see the human fleet flying toward Eth Prime. He could still see the children painted on their hulls. And for the first time in 40 years, he did not feel ashamed of what he saw in the mirror. The human fleet flew on. Behind them, the blockade held position, their weapons silent, their crews watching the strange species that had just taught them something about courage. Ahead of them, Eth Prime waited. They had 14 months left. High Matriarcha had accepted death. Her people had accepted death. They had written their final poems and composed their death songs, and prepared to face extinction with the dignity that had defined their species for 12,000 years. The children still played in the crystal gardens. The poets still wrote their verses. Life continued because what else could it do? But underneath the daily routines, everyone knew. Everyone was waiting. Everyone was preparing to say goodbye. And then the sky filled with ships. A was in her chambers when her advisor burst through the door. The young Eth was shaking so hard that her wings were humming. "Matriarch, Matriarch, you must see this." She led to the great observation plaza, where thousands of Eth had already gathered. They were looking up at the sky, and they were weeping. Ships, thousands of ships. They were entering orbit around Eth Prime, filling the darkness with light. Cargo freighters and passenger liners and mining vessels and hospital ships and hundreds of other craft that the Eth had no names for. And painted on their hulls, in colors bright enough to see from the ground, were pictures. Pictures of Eth children. Pictures of crystal wings and singing flowers and everything beautiful about a world that the galaxy had decided to let die. A shuttle landed in the plaza. The crowd parted to let it through. The doors opened and a human woman stepped out. She was small by Eth standards, soft and fragile-looking, with no wings and no crystalline features. Her uniform was wrinkled and her eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. She looked like she had not slept in months. But when she smiled, I understood why the galaxy was afraid of these creatures. "High Matriarch," the human said, her voice carrying across the silent plaza. "I am Admiral Helena of the Terran Coalition. We received your request for evacuation assistance." I found her voice. "We were told no one was coming." The human's smile widened. "You were told wrong." The evacuation began that day. It would later be called the greatest logistical operation in galactic history. 14 months to move 4 billion people. The numbers were impossible. The challenges were insurmountable. The mission could not succeed. The humans succeeded anyway. They did it with stubbornness and creativity and an absolute refusal to accept failure. When ships broke down, human engineers fixed them with spare parts that should not have worked, held together by solutions that violated common sense and prayer. When fuel ran low, colony worlds sent everything they had. When food supplies dwindled, humans invented new rationing systems that somehow fed everyone. They worked around the clock. Human pilots flew until they collapsed, then woke up and flew again. Human doctors treated who had never seen a human before, learning their biology on the job. Human volunteers carried children and elderly, and the sick and anyone else who needed help, their strange soft faces always smiling, always reassuring, always saying the same thing. It is going to be okay, we are here now. The ships made dozens of trips. They flew to new colony worlds that had volunteered to accept refugees. They carried poets and artists and scientists and farmers and everyone else who called prime home. They carried the crystal seeds that would allow the to grow new forests on foreign soil. They carried the ancient texts and the sacred artworks and everything that could be saved. Month after month, the evacuation continued. The neutron star drew closer. The planet began to shake with seismic activity. The oceans rose and fell. The crystal forests cracked. But the ships kept flying. On the last day, 6 hours before the neutron star's gravity would tear the planet apart, the final transport lifted off from the surface of Prime. High Matriarcha stood at the observation window, watching her world fall away beneath her. The crystal forests were shattering. The sapphire oceans were boiling. The mountains were crumbling into dust. Everything beautiful, everything ancient, everything that her people had built over 12,000 years was being destroyed. But her people were alive. Not a single had been left behind. Admiral stood beside her at the window. They watched together in silence as Prime came apart, a world dying in fire and light. "I am sorry," said softly. "I am sorry we could not save your world." A turned to look at her. This small, soft, fragile creature who had crossed a galaxy to save strangers, who had her own government and risked her own life and convinced thousands of others to do the same, who had refused to accept the unacceptable. "You saved something more important," I said. "You saved our children, you saved our future, you saved our hope." 3 months later, the Galactic Concord convened to address what they called the human crisis. They had prepared sanctions and condemnations and expulsion proceedings. They were going to make an example of these upstart creatures who had the natural order of things. Then they noticed that the gallery was full. Species who had not attended Concord sessions in centuries had sent representatives. Minor members who usually stayed silent were standing in the aisles. Even the hollow men had appeared, their crystal bodies flickering with strange mathematics. They were not there to condemn humanity. They were there to watch what the Conquered did next. The ambassador stood to speak. He looked around the chamber at all those watching eyes. He thought about who had resigned his commission rather than face court-martial. He thought about his own crews who had saluted the human fleet as it passed. He cleared his throat. In light of changing circumstances, the hegemony moves that all proceedings against the Terran coalition be discontinued. The motion passed unanimously. 50 years later, a museum opened on the New. It was called the Museum of Those Who Came. Inside were artifacts and images and records from the evacuation, the first shuttle, the fuel logs, the pictures that children had drawn to thank their rescuers. At the center of the museum stood a statue. It showed a human woman in a wrinkled uniform reaching out her hand. And rising to meet that hand was a child, wings spread, lifted from darkness into light. High Matriarcha, now very old, spoke at the dedication ceremony. Her voice was weak, but her words carried across the crowd. Our poets spent 10,000 years trying to define the soul of the universe, she said. They failed, but I have seen it now. It wears a human face. And when the galaxy turns its back, when hope seems lost, when the darkness closes in, it says 3 words that echo through eternity. She looked at Admiral, who had come for the ceremony despite her age and failing health. Their eyes met across the crowd. Not today. The crowd erupted in cheers. Eth and humans and a dozen other species, all celebrating together, all remembering. And on the base of the statue, carved in 17 languages, were the words that would define humanity's place in the galaxy forever. When the stars abandoned us, humanity carried us home. And below that, in letters that would never fade. Not today. The museum stands to this day. Visitors come from across the galaxy to see it. They look at the statue and read the words and hear the story of the species that refused to let children die because it was expensive to save them. And sometimes late at night, when the museum is empty and quiet, people say you can hear something. A whisper, a promise, 3 words that changed everything. Not today. Not today. Not today.